Think about what it costs to heat your home this winter. Think about what you paid last time you filled up your tank. Now imagine that somewhere on the other side of the world, there is a fleet of ghost ships carrying the fuel that was supposed to be stopped. It is still moving. It never stopped. And the people running it figured out how to make the West pay for the privilege of failing to stop it. This is the story of the most expensive sanctions backfire in modern history. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the United States and its allies launched what they called the most comprehensive economic punishment ever imposed on a major economy. Thousands of sanctions, asset freezes, export bans, a $60 per barrel price cap on Russian oil, designed by the G7 to drain the Kremlin's war chest while keeping global markets stable. The idea was simple. Cut off the money and the war runs out of fuel. There was just one problem. Nobody asked Russia how it planned to respond. Here is what actually happened. Within months, a network that intelligence analysts and energy researchers now call the Shadow Fleet began to take shape. Old tankers, some of them decades past their operational prime, were quietly purchased by shell companies in places like Dubai, the Marshall Islands, and Hong Kong. They changed their names. They swapped their flags to countries with minimal regulatory oversight. They switched off their tracking systems in the middle of open water. And then they sailed on, carrying Russian oil to buyers who were, officially, supposed to say no. As of August 2025, the broker firm BRS estimated that the Shadow Fleet had grown to over 1,100 oil tankers. That is more than 18% of the entire global oil tanker fleet, now operating outside the rules that the rest of the industry follows. Finland's Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air calculated that the annual profits flowing to Moscow through these shadow operations were running between $80 and $100 billion every year. While the sanctions were active, let that number sit for a moment. $80 to $100 billion a year. That is larger than the GDP of most countries on Earth. The buyers were not hard to find. India became Russia's single largest importer of crude oil after 2022, snapping up deeply discounted barrels that the West had walked away from. China followed. Turkey became a critical transit hub, refining Russian crude and selling the products into European markets under different labels. The Center for European Policy Analysis documented that, by mid-2025, Chinese independent refiners alone were absorbing hundreds of thousands of barrels per day of Russian crude through non-sanctioned intermediaries and opaque trading channels. The discounts tell you everything you need to know about how this system actually works. By late 2025, after the U.S. Treasury sanctioned Russia's two largest oil producers, Rosneft and Lukoil, the discount on Russian crude ballooned past $22 per barrel below the global benchmark. For India, for China, for Turkey, that discount was not a problem. It was a profit opportunity. The West had made Russian oil so cheap that not buying it became the economically irrational choice. And here is where the backfire starts to sting you personally. When Russia rerouted its oil away from Europe, Europe needed to replace it quickly. That meant competing globally for supplies from the Middle East, from the United States, from Africa. Global demand for non-Russian oil surged, so did prices. European wholesale gas prices peaked at levels that triggered real damage to household budgets, manufacturing costs, and consumer prices across the continent. German pump prices climbed past €2.40 per liter. European airlines, including Lufthansa, began canceling flights in large numbers. The sanctions designed to hurt Russia ended up transferring significant economic pain straight into the wallets of the people they were supposed to protect. Meanwhile, Russia was adapting faster than the enforcers could keep up. The Shadow Fleet deployed every trick available. Vessels would conduct ship-to-ship transfers in international waters at night, physically moving oil from a sanctioned tanker to a clean one, then continuing on as if nothing had happened. Ships would arrive in port under one name, leave under another. Ownership chains would run through 6 or 7 shell companies across 4 different jurisdictions before reaching anyone with a real address. The UK's National Crime Agency published a Red Alert report in July 2025, documenting the full scope of what it called the Sanctions Evasion and Avoidance Network. The report described a system that had become, in its own way, extraordinarily sophisticated. What makes this system so hard to stop is that it is not run by Russia alone. It is a distributed global network. Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan emerged as critical transit corridors for goods flowing into Russia that were supposed to be blocked by export controls. The UAE became a key financial hub for processing payments that could not go through Western banking systems. A 2026 analysis in The Wire documented how Maxim Oreshkin, a senior Russian economic official, publicly stated that by 2025, 54% of Russia's trade was being conducted in rubles and 31% in BRICS currencies, specifically to reduce exposure to dollar-denominated sanctions pressure. BRICS itself was actively building an alternative payments infrastructure that the US dollar could not touch. The Atlantic Council's Russia sanctions database, updated in April 2025, reached a stark conclusion. The sanctions had not stopped Russian oil from flowing. They had rerouted it and discounted it. And the discount was being paid by buyers who had no political interest in the war's outcome, which meant they had every reason to keep buying. There is a concept in economics called leakage. It describes what happens when you try to block a flow and it finds another path. Every sanctions regime leaks. The question is always, how much? In Russia's case, the leakage has been large enough to fund a multi-year land war in Europe. The numbers in 2025 are difficult to argue with. A U.S. Senate resolution introduced in December 2025 noted that Russian seaborne crude and product exports had averaged 5.7 million barrels per day that year. That was barely a marginal decline from the 5.8 million barrels per day recorded in 2024. After 3 years of the most intensive sanctions campaign ever mounted against a major oil producer, Russia was still selling essentially the same volume of oil it was selling before the restrictions began. The West did hurt Russia. Russia's total fossil fuel revenues fell 27% from pre-invasion levels, according to the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. That is real damage. The ruble weakened. Inflation inside Russia rose. Western components became harder to source. But the Kremlin made a calculated bet that economic pain could be absorbed, that the war could be funded, and that the global order was fractured enough to find buyers regardless of what Washington and Brussels announced. So far, that bet is still paying off. What this means for you is not abstract. It is in your energy bill. It is in the inflation that eroded your savings over the past 3 years. It is in the global realignment happening underneath the headlines, where India, China, Turkey, and a growing list of emerging economies are quietly building the infrastructure to trade outside the system that the United States and Europe have spent decades constructing. The BRICS alternative payment proposal from the 2024 summit was not just diplomatic theater, it was a blueprint. And Russia's shadow fleet was the proof of concept. The sanctions were supposed to be the West's strongest lever, the most powerful economic weapon available, short of direct military intervention. And Russia found the back door in the first 6 months. Think about what it costs to heat your home this winter. Some of that cost is the price of a system that was supposed to shut Russia out and instead taught the world how to route around it.